He's in the middle of an offensive, which I think has about 30,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. What does this look like from Central Command that's hatching a rescue plan? Are they thinking that they're going to send it in the middle of this fighting? Does this alter the U.S. defensive plans? What does it look like from the planning side of things?
Well, the planning was done from a unit called Joker, was down around Saigon, and they were in charge of coordinating rescue attempts in Southeast Asia. So what they did originally was they sent people who were already in the area. There were helicopters, there were fighter jets, A-1s, who were already supporting the mission that Hambleton had been on. So they tried to send them in for a quick snatch and get him out of there. That didn't work. And they were not quite aware that this enemy offensive was underway. They thought that Hambleton was down in sort of an ordinary place in the jungle, that he was going to be surrounded by an ordinary amount of AAA. That was not true. So they started to send in these pilots, and the pilots were reporting back, I'm seeing more fire from the ground than I've ever seen before in Vietnam. Something is wrong. And there was a disconnect really between the intelligence that they were getting and the situation on the ground. So they started to lose pilots and aircraft pretty quickly. 2 guys were shot down the first day, really within the first hours of the mission. And they slowly came to realize that this was going to be an extraordinary mission that was going to require an extraordinary commitment on their part of men and material.
At what point does capture occur, if it does? What's the process like as he's trying to evade it?
Well, he found himself a very good hiding place. He was in a thicket of trees that bordered on some farmland. So he was good for the moment. And what's sort of interesting in the early parts of this rescue is that the Air Force basically stopped fighting the Vietnam War in order to get this one guy back. Wow. They stopped supporting South Vietnamese units with airstrikes, moved all that sort of firepower over to the Hambleton mission. And there were guys on the ground, there were Marine advisors that were assigned to South Vietnamese units, and they're being overwhelmed by these North Vietnamese troops, and they're shouting on the radio, where's our air? Where's our air? And the answer came back is, we have a guy down, don't bother us. So there was a great deal of sort of anger and miscommunication in those early hours of the rescue. You can talk about the fog of war, but there were men who died because resources were shifted away from repelling this offensive in order to get Gene Hambleton back. And there are guys today who are still bitter about that, who believe that, a guy who goes down has to take his chances. If a major attack is underway, the attack comes first and not rescuing one of our own. So it was a real dilemma in the early hours of the rescue, and became a very sort of intense argument between Marines, Air Force, and the sort of commanding officers who were directing the rescue.
Yeah, this is an interesting moral dilemma, and I'm curious, from what you read and the interview subjects that you had, do you have a sense of what the toll was for putting the counterstrike on hold in order to rescue him? Have there been any estimates of the possible loss of life or damage? Just so we get a sense of this moral dilemma that they were up against.
We have to say that the rescue effort, the planes who were up trying to kill the AAA around Gene Hambleton, were also hitting targets that were involved in this enemy offensive. They were just a couple of days behind the leading edge of the offensive. So the Marines and the South Vietnamese troops who were actually under fire, they wanted the leading elements taken out. And the Air Force was basically going after guys who were half a mile behind the front line. So it's hard to judge, but I think we can say safely that at least dozens of South Vietnamese troops in those initial hours were probably killed as a result of the Air Force concentrating on Gene Hambleton, concentrating on getting this American out, while their allies were really under an onslaught that few had seen in the war up to that point.
Well, in the subtitle of your book, you call it the greatest rescue mission in Navy SEAL history. So let's look at that. Can you paint the picture as the rescue mission is being hatched? What were the plans to rescue him? What kind of numbers of enemy troops were they looking at? And yeah, can you paint this picture? This is really interesting.
Sure. So they were planning what was a classic Vietnam rescue, which is airborne helicopters supported by both helicopter gunships and by fighter planes, by attack aircraft. And they had plenty of those. I mean, they were calling in planes from Thailand, from other bases in Vietnam. They were working out of Joker they even had weathermen who were sort of plotting what the cloud cover would be like. That was very important in a helicopter rescue. So there was no sort of overland manned unit going after Gene Hambleton. It was all coming from the air. And this is something that Americans really had kind of perfected during the Vietnam War. So it was something they were relying on technology, and they believed they could get a man out of almost any sort of circumstances that existed in Vietnam, unless you were up by Hanoi, which was ringed by tremendous amounts of AAA. If he was down further south in the jungle, they were going to send two Huey helicopter rescue helicopters, one high bird, one low bird. The low bird would go in first. If it aborted or if it got in trouble, the high bird would come in after it, pick up the original rescue target and also the crew of the low bird. And at the same time, the fighter planes would be hitting all the AAA around the target, basically purifying the area so that the rescue team could go in. And this had been done time and time and again with great success, really, in Vietnam. You know, we'd been there a number of years. It's 1972. The military really felt that they perfected this kind of rescue. And in large part they had. They just hadn't run into an enemy force in such numbers and in such intensity that planes were basically being deconstructed in the air. They were being torn apart by AAA. SAM missiles were going off. One guy told me it looked like the 4th of July and the finale of the fireworks show. It was that bad. So the military was really experiencing something it hadn't seen before in Vietnam. And it takes the military mind, the military bureaucracy, often a great deal of time to process that information. And they were being asked to do that in a matter of hours. And they were unable to sort of do that. So they kept sending rescue team after rescue team, helicopters and airplanes. And guys were dying out there. A total of 11 died before the helicopters were grounded. A lot of helicopters never flew again. A lot of planes limped back to their bases and shot up beyond belief. So it was becoming more and more dire, and there was no real plan B that worked in Vietnam. Not a lot of guys went overland to save their brothers, but that's really where the Navy SEAL Tommy Norris comes in.
Okay, so could you describe the difference between these first missions, which you mentioned failed, where 11 men die, these air rescue missions, versus the Navy SEAL mission? So what are the big differences?
So the Navy SEAL mission did not involve helicopters at all. What they were going to do, this is day 10 of the rescue. The 11 men are already dead. Hambleton is increasingly hallucinating. He's weak. He hasn't had solid food. He's had very little water. He's a 52-year-old guy and, not in the best of shape. And he's about a mile and a half, 2 miles from the New Giang River. And what the military decides to do is send a team of South Vietnamese Sea Commandos, guys who are practiced in, operating in water, along with one Navy SEAL, Tommy Norris, a young guy from Silver Spring, Maryland, by now a legend, but then he was pretty well unknown. And they were going to go up the river, connect with Hambleton, put him either on a canoe, one of the sort of Vietnamese fishing canoes, bring him back down, or just walk him out. But the problem there is that you're walking out and you're walking in with 30,000 NVA troops around you at night. So if you try to imagine the Vietnamese doing it in reverse, trying in, say, 1968 to go behind American lines into, place is controlled by Marines and Army units, what are the chances of success there? And I think they were pretty low going in. And Tommy Norris and his partner Nguyen Van Kiet, who was a South Vietnamese Sea Commando, knew the risk they were taking, and so they went in. And not only had they have to get Hambleton, but there was another guy who'd been shot down, who had secreted himself right by the river, and they had to get him first, bring him out, go back and get Hambleton. A really almost impossible mission.
Can you describe how they first cross enemy lines? How much evasion do they have to do? Is there a constant risk of capture the whole time, or are they able to find their way to them in a way that's not as heavily patrolled?
They went in at night. Their headquarters was this French bunker, which was behind our lines, but right up on the river. So they were facing across at VA units, and they could see them across the river. And they were going to go in at night and just use the reeds and the tree cover to sort of disguise themselves. But they were dressed. Tommy Norris was wearing denim and a military shirt, but they were not disguised as Vietnamese fishermen as they were later. If they had been spotted, if they had sort of clinked one of their rifles against a belt buckle, it was really that close cut. There were patrols of NVA troops up and down the river. So they had to sort of weave their way up among the reeds of the riverbank and try to get to the meeting point where they were expecting to meet Hambleton. And the thing about Hambleton was he had lost 40 pounds. He was extremely weak. He was seeing things that weren't there, near delirious. And one of the most interesting things about the mission is that the military had to get him to the riverbank, giving him distance and direction, but in a way that the North Vietnamese who were listening in on the radio wouldn't understand. So for that, they turned to the game of golf. Hamilton was a golf fanatic, and they started feeding him famous holes like the 14th, the Master. And Hamilton was so obsessed with the game that he knew, okay, that's, say, 360 feet, 360 yards, and its direction is northeast. So he would head out on that direction, get to his spot, and wait for the next command. So they were kind of, bringing him around enemy emplacements, bringing him around danger areas on his way to the river using famous golf holes.
Those are the wind talkers of the Vietnam War. The poor North Vietnamese intelligence, someone probably tried to learn a Native American language hearing about the wind talkers, and now they have to learn golf terminology, so it's all thrown out the window.
Well, the military actually, one of the guys told me that they checked an atlas looking for a golf course in North Vietnam. They didn't find any. So, any other reference, even if you wanted to use like a Hitchcock reference, North by Northwest, there's a chance that some North Vietnamese intelligence agent who had studied in the West might have known that reference. So you couldn't use sort of, easy cultural references. And golf just turned out to be the perfect thing. It had both direction and distance, and it really worked perfectly.
Right, and not very popular in Southeast Asia. So really clever way to get around it. So as they're going overland, you said that at one point they were disguised as fishermen, but not during the entire mission?
Right. So they went up 3 times, actually. The first time they got Mark Clark, who was the other aviator who was down, who's also starting to hallucinate in bad shape. They bring him out. They go up the second night, and a bunch of the Sea Commandos start sort of getting anxious because they know that you can only do this so many times before you get caught. And if you're caught, you're either going to be killed or you're going to go to a North Vietnamese prison where, you're likely to be tortured, etc. So at one point they came back to the base and they said, we're not going again. It's not worth risking our lives to get a single American. And Tommy Norris, who was, he was the head of the mission, he said that he understood this. Like, how many times can you risk your life for a single American? So he decided he was going to go upriver alone on the third night. Hamilton was already in place, but he was too weak to move. And he thought he was just going to do it by himself. But this very brave and heroic South Vietnamese commando, Nguyen Van Kiet, said, if you go, I go. I'm not going to leave you let you do that by yourself. So on the third night, they disguised themselves as Vietnamese fishermen, put on the hats, black peasant clothing, and they got one of these little fishing canoes that they got from a nearby village and some paddles that Tommy Norris had ordered up from Saigon. And they just started rowing up this river with patrols passing both,